She insulted what seemed to be an ordinary customer, only to find out he owned the place and was Clint Eastwood. The midday sun streamed through the large windows of Sierra Grill, a cozy yet bustling restaurant in Carmel by the Sea, California. While it wasn't a fancy spot, it had a charm that drew locals in, especially on warm Thursday afternoons. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress trying to make ends meet, that charm did little to ease her growing frustration. From the moment she clocked in, her shift had been utter chaos. "Table 6 needs extra dressing," a coworker called out, but Megan didn't even glance up as she scribbled down yet another order on her notepad. Her ponytail swayed as she darted between tables, juggling complaints about undercooked steaks, split checks, and missing drink orders. To make matters worse, 3 rude customers had stiffed her on tips that day, leaving nothing but a few coins. By the time an elderly man, likely in his 80s, quietly walked in and took a seat at a corner table, Megan was already at her breaking point. He wore a slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn Stetson hat resting on the table. His boots looked like they had trudged through decades of dirt roads. She gave him a quick glance and muttered under her breath, "Great. Another one who'll probably order coffee and leave me $1." She couldn't ignore him for long, though. Her coworker nudged her and whispered, "Table 12 is yours." With a sigh, Megan grabbed her notepad and approached him, pasting on her practiced smile. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone edging on impatience. The man looked up, his sharp eyes scanning her face. Something about him seemed familiar, but Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he said calmly, his voice low and gravelly, carrying an air of quiet authority. "Burger. Got it. Anything else?" Megan asked, tapping her pen on the notepad. "No, ma'am," he replied, tipping his hat slightly. She rolled her eyes as she walked back to the kitchen. "Ma'am? Really?" she muttered under her breath. Yet something about him stuck in her mind. He wasn't rude, demanding, or dismissive like other customers. There was a quiet confidence about him, almost as if he were observing everything around him. Shrugging it off, Megan returned a few minutes later with his burger. She set the plate down a bit carelessly, her forced smile barely hiding her exhaustion. "Here you go," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anything else?" The man glanced at the burger, and then back at her. "No, this looks just fine." "Thank you," he said politely, his tone firm yet respectful. His words made Megan feel oddly self-conscious. Something about his composure annoyed her. Unlike everyone else in the restaurant who was either snapping fingers, complaining, or rushing, he sat calmly, as if unaffected by the chaos around him. "You're not from around here, are you?" she asked, leaning on the table's edge. "No, I'm not," he replied simply, cutting his burger in half with precise movements. "Thought so," she said with a smirk. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old western." For the first time, the man smiled faintly. "Something like that," he said. Expecting him to get defensive or annoyed, Megan was thrown off when he didn't react the way she'd hoped. Frustrated, she walked away, muttering under her breath. As she wiped down another table nearby, Megan noticed him watching her. Not in a creepy way, but with an expression that made her feel like she was being evaluated. It was unsettling, and she couldn't figure out why it bothered her so much. What Megan didn't know was that this unassuming encounter was about to change her day and her life in ways she never imagined. The midday sun poured through the large windows of Sierra Grill, a modest yet charming restaurant nestled in Carmel by the Sea, California. It wasn't high-end, but it had its appeal, a mix of rustic and modern touches that locals adored, especially on a warm Thursday afternoon. For Megan, a 23-year-old waitress trying to make ends meet, the restaurant's charm did little to soften her mounting frustration. Since the start of her shift, chaos seemed to follow her. One table needed extra dressing, another flagged her down to complain about a slightly undercooked steak, and tips had been appallingly low. To top it off, 3 particularly rude customers had already left her on edge. By the time an older man quietly strolled in and took a seat at a corner table, Megan was frazzled. He didn't stand out much, wearing a slightly wrinkled flannel shirt, faded jeans, and a well-worn Stetson that rested on the table. His boots looked as though they'd trekked countless dusty roads. Megan gave him a cursory glance and smirked faintly, muttering under her breath, "Great, another one who's probably going to order a coffee and leave me $1." Her coworker nudged her, whispering, "You've got table 12. With an exasperated sigh, Megan grabbed her notepad and forced a practiced smile as she approached. "What can I get you today?" she asked, her tone teetering on impatience. The man looked up, his piercing eyes studying her for a moment. There was something oddly familiar about him, though Megan couldn't quite place it. "Just a burger," he replied, his voice low and gravelly, carrying an air of quiet authority. "Burger. Got it. Anything else?" she asked, tapping her pen against the notepad. "No, ma'am," he said with a polite nod. Megan bit back an eye roll as she turned away, muttering under her breath, "Ma'am. Really?" In the kitchen, as she submitted his order, a flicker of curiosity crossed her mind. Something about the man seemed different. Not rude or demanding, but quietly confident, as if he were watching and waiting for something. Megan quickly shrugged it off as she rushed to the next table, her frustrations bubbling under the surface. Minutes later, she returned with his burger, unceremoniously setting the plate in front of him. "Here you go," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Anything else?" The man inspected his meal briefly before replying, "No, this looks just fine. Thank you." There was no sarcasm, no complaint, just polite gratitude. Yet something about his calm demeanor annoyed Megan. Everyone else in the restaurant seemed to mirror her chaos, snapping fingers and hurling complaints. But not him. "You're not from around here, are you?" Megan asked abruptly, leaning slightly on the table. "No, I'm not," he answered, cutting his burger in half with deliberate precision. "Thought so," Megan said, smirking. The hat gave it away. "Looks like you just stepped out of an old Western movie." For the first time, the man smiled faintly. "Something like that," he replied. Megan expected him to get defensive, but his composure remained intact. That only frustrated her more. "Well, enjoy your meal," she said curtly, walking away before he could say anything else. As the lunch rush waned and the restaurant grew quieter, Megan finally caught her breath. Her gaze wandered back to table 12, where the man sat finishing his burger, appearing in no rush. "Hey, Megan," her coworker Danny said, leaning over. "Don't you think that guy looks familiar?" Megan shrugged. "Not really." "Why?" "I dunno," Danny replied thoughtfully. "Maybe he's famous." "He's got that look." Megan scoffed. "Famous?" "Yeah, right. If he's famous, then I'm the Queen of England." Shrugging, Danny walked away, leaving Megan to deliver the man's check. "Here's your check," Megan said, placing it on the table with a faint smile. "Whenever you're ready." The man looked up, meeting her gaze with an intensity that made her falter. "Do you enjoy your job?" he asked, his tone calm yet deliberate. The unexpected question threw her off. "It's fine," she replied with a shrug. "It's a job, you know?" He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. "The job's what you make of it. But it seems like you're carrying a lot today." Megan's cheeks flushed. Who was this guy to comment on her attitude? Crossing her arms, she snapped back, "Look, I've had a rough shift, okay? Not everyone gets to sit around eating burgers and handing out life advice." To her surprise, the man wasn't offended. He simply smiled faintly and stood, pulling out a few bills to pay. "Fair enough," he said. "But sometimes how you treat people in those moments says more about you than you think." Megan froze as his words sank in, and before she could reply, he walked toward the door. Just as he reached the exit, her manager, Carol, appeared, her expression lighting up. "Mr. Eastwood," she exclaimed, hurrying toward him. "What a surprise. I wasn't expecting you today." Megan's heart stopped. "Eastwood." "Clint Eastwood." She turned, wide-eyed, just in time to see him glance back at her briefly, a knowing look in his eyes before he walked out the door. Her mind reeled. She had brushed off Clint Eastwood, the Clint Eastwood, and, worse, insulted him in his own restaurant. For weeks after, Clint's words echoed in Megan's mind. Every interaction's an opportunity. Use it well. Slowly but surely, Megan began to change. Though she didn't become perfect overnight, she approached her job with newfound patience and humility. Over time, customers noticed, and so did Carol. Months later, as Megan locked up the restaurant, she couldn't help but smile. Clint Eastwood had walked in on a chaotic Thursday and left her with a lesson she'd carry for a lifetime. Sometimes, the smallest moments leave the biggest impact.